Opposition ran their first substantive, which is about the overall support of the environmentalist movement. Firstly, they ran that moderates are neutral, so not for or against climate change. Just in the status quo, they're not willing to vote against climate change. But in the proposition world, these once neutral moderates will now become actively oppositional to the environmentalist movement. Secondly, they ran that voters who are currently willing to vote for environmental policies will now become apathetic because they're stuck between voting for environmentalist movements and voting against anti-capitalist policies. And thirdly, that whenever environmentalist movements are anti-capitalist, that they will always garner greater corporate backlash. The second substantive that they went for was an argument about the quality. So pretty much like comparing public policy versus private action. And they were just like, firstly, that in a world in which you have a greater amount of state-owned enterprises, that there will be less overall competition, and that means that there will be less innovation. And secondly, that private entities are always have a greater ability or capability to invest into green technology than the public sector, so that we'll have lower quality transition to a green future or to a non-renewable future. The third substantive argument was just that even if that there is a rise in socialism in the global south, that the West will always react with economic intervention because they want to protect capitalism as like the main economic system of the world, and will always will always move to squash the rise of socialism in the rest of the world. And obviously examples would be like Chile or South Africa. So yeah. Team opposition loses the debate round whenever they choose for their advocacy to be to regulate capitalism as much as possible. Because at that point, they concede that capitalism is the root cause and that we should aim to regulate capitalists and corporations as much as possible. They concede the prop ground. Prop is far ahead. In this speech, I'll begin by first quickly clarifying the comparative, which they tried to muddle in the second opposition speech, addressing their third substantive argument, and then giving you two nexus questions upon which I will prove that proposition is far ahead. First, in the comparative, though, in the proposition world, the environmental movement will explicitly denounce capitalism as a root cause. They will blame the system, the capitalist system, as opposed to individuals within the system. They will explicitly advocate for decreasing the prominence of corporations through things like very strong taxation or very strong regulations, and increasing the expansion of the government through things like increasing the prominence or funding for state-owned enterprises, or for increasing access or funding for welfare. Opposition environmental movement will instead blame the individual and not the system, and advocate for regulated capitalism, for example, things to carbon taxes, regulations, etc. Their third substantive argument told you that the West will crush nations who they perceive to have a rise of socialism. Three key responses that we have here. First, this is unlikely to happen at the point at which there's a very strong international checkback from either international bodies like the United Nations or from competing superpowers like China. Secondly, though, we would say that this is unlikely to happen whenever there's very strong internal checkback within Western democracies. They will always lose the ballot box if they do something perceived to be deeply immoral. Third, though, we would say at their absolute highest ground, this argument is of extremely low impact because these nations have a history of being exploited by the West have already developed their own alternative means for investment in alliances. For example, it doesn't matter if the West sanctions Venezuela if they'll trade with Cuba and Mexico, or if they turn to China and their Belt and Road Initiative. Overall, a very low impact here. With that out of the way, though, two nexus questions for today's debate. Firstly, which one has stronger environmental movements? And second, which one accesses higher quality reform? This first point of clash about the strength of environmental movements is extremely important because it is a direct prerequisite to creating or to accessing policy or cultural change. The opposition here told you three key things. First, that moderates tend to be neutral and become oppositional in our world. Secondly, that we increase voter apathy. And thirdly, that we increase corporate backlash. Two key responses I want to forward here. Remember what my second speaker told you. They told you that they terribly mischaracterize and overgeneralize the political climate. Because in reality, moderates aren't neutral. In the United States, 2 out of every 3 voters believe the government should take more active stances in fighting climate change. Internationally, 7 out of every 10 voters believe that climate change is an existential issue. Judges, if it's true that people perceive climate change to be an existential issue, they won't care if the movement is socialist because they want to stop climate change. No legal work from the opposition here. Secondly, though, on this idea of corporate backlash, at opposition's highest ground, this argument will always be non-unique because they say a very low bright line. They say, hey, whenever you harm the profit of corporations, then there will be backlash. But if this is true, it goes against their own advocacy of things like carbon taxes or regulations. On proposition's highest ground, however, corporations will always be more benevolent on our world because they never want to be perceived as like right-wing populists or as climate change deniers. At that point, any like corporate backlash really happens in the very short term. They will always buy into the movement in the long term because they don't want that negative PR. We gave you 3 key pieces of positive material which I want to forward. First, we will always have greater amounts of awareness in our world whenever there's a certain shock value associated with calling an environmentalist movement anti-capitalist and socialist. We always have greater awareness and education on this environmentalist movement by having greater media coverage. Second, though, that we always have greater buy-in whenever we blame the collective system as opposed to individuals within the system. Note, the opposition movement will always alienate the working class or individuals who don't want to feel guilty. Because telling an individual you are an inherently immoral person for buying from corporations to harm the environment will always alienate them because either they feel like there's nothing else they could have done or because they want to feel guilty. They're much more likely to buy into the proposition movement as much as we blame the system, saying we understand it's not your fault, you're forced to work 8 hours a day and then buy from bad corporations. It's rather the fault of the system. Thus, you have greater buy-in and greater support from these people. Thirdly, you have greater buy-in from more leftist social groups. They don't buy to the environmental movement right now because either to be like fake and corporatist or because they just don't believe that it's like leftist enough, right? We say they're much more likely to support the movement in our whenever it is for one of two reasons. Either because they believe to be more legitimate and genuine and thus support the movement, or because even they don't believe that like climate change is a huge issue, they view the environmentalist movement as a way to access a mechanism to access a socialist future. Thus, you have more buy-in. 3 key weighing mechanisms here. First, you have a greater magnitude and a prominence of protest demonstrations for environmentalist movements. Second, we have greater support and buy into the environmentalist movement. And we have greater awareness, greater buy-in, etc. And thirdly, we are able to act significantly faster change because we have stronger, larger demonstrations against the government and force them to respond. The second nexus question that we'll be asking, which one has higher quality, reform, and change? This point of clash is the most important because we do not care if opposition movements are the most popular ever if the change they advocate for and ultimately create is ineffective or actively detrimental. Their policy here told you that we have less innovation in our world because the state has very weak investment. Seek your response here. First, this just simply isn't true. If you look at Western European nations, they invest a lot into green technology and things in this manner. But even if it is true, changes in our world whenever we have an environmental movement which explicitly advocates for increasing investment into state programs to help combat climate change. Secondly, though, at their highest ground, we just do not think that innovation is really a voting issue in today's round because innovation already exists. We can already give people access to healthcare. We can already build seawalls. We can already suck carbon in the environment. We need pressure to force governments and corporations to do so. We need to create that pressure in the proposition world. 2 key pieces of positive material that we have on the comparative. Firstly, we said that our change is always going to be preferable whenever we better target the root cause. Because no, they inherently concede that capitalism is in fact the root cause, but it's set to focus on the strength or effectiveness of the movement. 2 key problems though. First, that our laws have higher quality reform, but if we don't target individuals, rather a larger system which forces individuals to do things like harm the environment. Secondly, though, that we don't target specific single issues like opposition does, but rather target the larger system. For example, at best, maybe they do get a carbon tax, but they don't get other policies, for example, targeting overpollution, overfishing, or methane emissions. Whenever we target the root cause, which is capitalism, we're able to stop all these further downstream impacts. Second, though, we have a higher quality change whenever we shift the political spectrum further to the left. We allow for these dissenting groups to meet in the middle, which will always be further to the left in our world. Thus, we always access stronger, more nuanced leftist policies, and they can access if they are forced to compromise and move even closer to the center. They will always be closer to the center, access lower quality change in their world. 2 key pieces of weighing, though. Firstly, note that our solvency will always be significantly further reaching whenever we don't target specific issues and are enforced to target specific issues like the use of political capital, as opposed to using all that political capital to focus on a single issue, which is capitalism, which is then able to address all these further downstream impacts. We have a greater degree of solvency. Secondly, though, we have greater amounts of accountability. Even if there is some capability for state detriments, there's always greater accountability on the government than there is on private corporations. At that point, you always vote for the proposition because you have stronger movements, but at ops highest ground, the change that we create is always of higher quality. For these reasons, I'm extremely proud.